fate is a race, destructions, production, malfunctions, obstruction. I can't breathe, I can't eat. This disease inside me, overbearing, it's flaring, unsparing. I carry in this cell, I will dwell, locked in this mental cell. No escape from my fate, so I can operate. Position is mission to gain back the possession, no more rights to hear that.
So with the United States finally having entered the war, we saw that J.P. Morgan would no longer be the purchasing agent for the Allies. And those duties, and so much more, would fall under the control of Bernard Baruch, pictured here with President Wilson's war cabinet. And we're going to see how Bernard Baruch eventually became in control of almost everything across the United States and abroad during World War I. Everything except food, that is. That fell to future President Herbert Hoover. And notice sitting in front of him is William McAdoo, President Wilson's Secretary of the Treasury, who helped keep the Lusitanians Manifest kept hidden from the public. When you look into Bernard Baruch's past, like some of his Wall Street buddies, he too came from a somewhat prominent background, which, also like some of his Wall Street buddies, has an interesting past. His father was Dr. Simon Baruch, and he was the Surgeon Major of the Field Medical Staff for General Robert E. Lee of the Confederate Army in the Civil War. So that's rather interesting, you think? Anyways, after the Civil War, Dr. Simon Baruch would go on to be a prominent and respected doctor around the country, writing articles on various ailments and having some of his works published in the medical record. So Bernard Baruch's upbringing was prominent enough that in 1897, his engagement to Annie Griffin would make the society pages. And as we can see, he was quite muscular in his youth, as well as very tall. In January of 1900, we see a merging of a couple of major trust companies, and the directors include Frank Rockefeller right off the bat. And of course he's the younger brother of John D. and William Rockefeller. And we also see Bernard Baruch as one of the directors. And I find it rather interesting that we see a connection between Bernard Baruch and Frank Rockefeller at this point in time, at the beginning of 1900. And we'll see why I find this date to be very interesting a little later on. Now at this point, Bernard Baruch is only 29 years old, but he is making his mark on Wall Street already, and is about to explode on the scene in the coming years. But being so young, and I'll hazard a guess here and say he's probably the youngest person in this list of names of directors, but with his semi-prominent background and his rapid rise on Wall Street already underway, I'll bet Frank Rockefeller had taken notice of him already, and they've likely had more than just a few meetings over time. Anyways, in 1902, we see this article, which says, "The substantial decline in amalgamated copper has brought into prominence a man," and they mean brought into prominence to the public, and of course that man is Bernard Baruch. And the article goes on to praise him, saying Baruch is more active, more successful, more shrewd, and more powerful than any and all of them, talking about some of the Wall Street crowd. And when you look up Bernard Baruch in modern-day outlets, that's how he's perceived. One of the great American business leaders of the 20th century. Great contemporary, and there he is pictured with Winston Churchill, who, as we'll see, he was longtime friends with. There's a college named after him. And here's one you probably didn't know, but it was Bernard Baruch who coined the term Cold War. And here's a glowing headline that says Bernard Baruch was as constant as the Northern Star. And that's something I agree with, and we'll come back and visit that later on. But right now, let's go back in time and have a look at some of the stuff that modern-day media outlets don't tell us about Bernard Baruch. Such as this case in May of 1913, where Bernard Baruch was a co-defendant, who lost a minor case concerning silver mines in Cobalt, Ontario, Canada. Minor for his stature, that is. Looks like they tried to cheat Charles Flynn out of his rightful money. In August of 1913, we see that New York Governor William Sulzer is in a lot of hot water because of alleged stock gambling and hidden campaign contributions. And by October 1913, he would be impeached, convicted, and removed from office on October 17, 1913. And we also see that large contributions to Sulzer came from pretty prominent names, including Bernard Baruch. Now those aren't really very nefarious actions on Baruch's part, but it does show a pattern, which increases. Now let's have a look at a major scandal that Baruch was involved in. President Wilson was re-elected in November 1916, and, ironically enough, part of what he ran on was that he had kept the United States out of the war. On December 18, 1916, so about a month after his re-election and about 4 months before declaring war on Germany, Wilson wrote a private telegram to German Kaiser Wilhelm proposing peace terms. A private note that was not supposed to be known to anyone at the time of its sending, though the world would know about it the following day when European newspapers would write about it. But on January 2, 1917, a couple of weeks after the private note was sent, we see in the headlines, "Alleged leak of peace note creates stir in Washington." Congress is once more stirred up over the issue whether someone in official life has such close connections with Wall Street that he or his friends were able to make $60 million out of the market selling short on advanced information of the president's peace note. William R. Hearst's newspaper started the trouble by printing a story that Bernard M. Baruch and Thomas W. Lawson had cleaned up a considerable sum by selling war stocks short in anticipation of the news that a formidable peace movement was to be launched by the president. And Bernard Baruch did make around $500,000 on these deals. And while I'm not sure how much Lawson made, there were a whole bunch of others that were named as being involved as well, as we'll see. The article here also notes, "It is certain that the Wall Street operators on the short side of the market had very definite information that the peace note was to be made by the president." Then we see the next day, on January 3rd, 1917, that Thomas Lawson would break and start to talk. Lawson charges that a leak to Wall Street preceded the president's note made public 2 weeks ago. And down below we see the name of Bernard Baruch, the president of the Council of National Defense, was mentioned by Congressman Bennett. And just to note, Baruch wasn't the president of the Council of National Defense, but he was a member, and he was the most active member and the public face of the council, which is why many at the time thought he was the president or chairman of the council, but he was actually the chairman of the advisory committee, which was part of the council, and we'll have a look at all that coming up shortly. But Congressman Bennett would go on to say, "I'll tell you what they are saying," said Congressman Bennett. "It is all over New York and financial circles generally that Bernard Baruch, president of the Council of National Defense, knew the contents of the peace note hours before anybody else, and sold 15,000 shares of United States Steel's common, short, on a rising market." So that's pretty interesting. Baruch selling short on United States Steel stock, right at that exact time? That's a pretty good coincidence. On January 5th, 1917, we see in the headlines, "Secretary Tumulty is charged with being guilty of leak rumors." Representative Wood makes public letter from New York implicating President's secretary, brother-in-law, and various stock operators. And Tumulty demands an apology. And here's Joseph Tumulty in 1913, with President Wilson's personal physician Cary Grayson and Bernard Baruch, of course, as Baruch was one of President Wilson's biggest campaign contributors and was good friends with many in Wilson's cabinet. And to note, the position of President's personal secretary, which Tumulty was at the time, would eventually go on to become the title, White House Chief of Staff. And the President's brother-in-law was Richard W. Bowling, one of the President's wife's brothers, and naturally he hung around in the elite social circles of the rich and famous of the time. On January 9th, 1917, we see in the headlines, Baruch denies he got tip. And we also see Lawson will bear name of leaky official if Congress will sift whole peace panic incident. So Lawson is willing to talk, but only if Congress investigates everything. And by January 13th, 1917, we see Lawson would get his wish, and Congress would empower a committee to do an investigation, and Lawson would be the first witness called. And on January 16, 1917, we see that Lawson would drop a stunning bombshell list of names of the people who, along with himself, benefited in some form from the advanced leak of the President's peace note. Lawson names McAdoo, Pliny Fisk, a senator with the last name starting with O, also testifies to multi-gain by leak, and brings in Paul M. Warburg as an insider. Says Lansing met Baruch. Bernstorff won $2 million, and that's the same Bernstorff, the German ambassador from the Lusitania story. And Lawson would name this group as those who benefited most directly from the financial side of selling short on large amounts of stock, later affected by the President's peace note when made public. And of course, everybody's denying Lawson's claims. And remember, a lot of that stock was U.S. steel. So of course on January 16, 1917, we see Morgan magnates summoned. The men summoned are J.P. Morgan and H.P. Davison of the Morgan Company, and F.A. Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank. And don't forget, as we saw earlier, Davison and Vanderlip were two of the guys that drafted the plan that would go on to become the Federal Reserve. On January 18, 1917, we see Thomas W. Lawson, in testifying Monday and Tuesday before the House Rules Committee, which is investigating the alleged leak on the President's note, declared that Chairman Henry of the committee had told him in confidence not only that such conferences, 4 in number, had taken place between Secretary Lansing and Mr. Baruch, but that the Rules Committee was in possession of details concerning at least one of those conferences. So the inference here is that Bernard Baruch was tipped off ahead of time by the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, about President Wilson's peace note to Germany. And to note, the chairman of the House Rules Committee, Robert Henry, would deny Lawson's claims and call him a liar. And Secretary of State Robert Lansing would not only deny the meetings took place, but he denied ever having met Bernard Baruch in his life, which I found rather surprising considering Baruch was very good friends with so many in the Wilson administrations right from the start. And I did search around, but I couldn't find any examples of Lansing and Baruch crossing paths previously, so who knows? Maybe they didn't, or maybe those meetings were the first times they ever met perhaps. So who knows? When Bernard Baruch would testify, he would deny talking with Lansing as well, of course. He would also testify that he wasn't the beneficiary of any leak, of course, but rather was just following world events, namely in Britain and Germany and the Japanese market, when he made his moves selling short. And we also see from Bernard Baruch's testimony on January 30th that he made $476,168 on those deals. And I found this to be rather interesting. A general denial was offered by Baruch that he had any communication with anyone in Washington about the time of the President's peace note in regard to it. He talked with Secretary MacLeod 2 or 3 times, he said, about an appointment to the Federal Reserve Board. Why he called MacLeod? Testifying that during the leak period he had called up Secretary MacLeod, Baruch explained that he had done so at the instance of Colonel E.M. House, President Wilson's advisor, to suggest to the Secretary the name of a man to fill a vacancy in the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He said that Colonel House had called him by telephone and said, "There is a vacancy in the Federal Reserve Bank. I don't know anything about those fellows down there. Won't you suggest a name?" And like I say, I found that rather interesting. Remember from an earlier chapter, Colonel Edward Mandell House was with King George in the hours before the Lusitania was sunk when King George asked House what the U.S. would do if Germany sunk the Lusitania. And of course, as I like to remind you, Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo played a role in the cover-up of the truth in the Lusitania's sinking. And these guys are turning to the Wolf of Wall Street for advice on who to name to the Federal Reserve in New York? They don't have a better system in place for this kind of thing? And of course not, or they wouldn't be able to do the stuff they do. Anyways, by February 23rd, 1917, we see in the headlines, "Blame for leak, not on officials. Rules Committee of House spreads whitewash in sweeping manner. Full report made later." The House Rules Committee today decided to report that its investigations of an alleged leak on President Wilson's peace note had shown no public officials were responsible for any advance information on it becoming public. The full report will not be prepared before Saturday. And there you go. No officials were involved in advance leaking of the knowledge of President Wilson's peace note. $60 million was indeed made from selling short on stocks in which the peace note, once made public, did affect those very stocks, and there was an alleged leak, just not done by any officials, or so the official narrative would record in the history books, according to the investigation done by the House Rules Committee, whose chairman, Robert Henry, was also implicated in the scandal by Thomas Lawson. But come on, it's Lawson's word and a couple of other minor players against all these people. Who do you think is going to win that battle? And we see on February 24th, 1917, the leak investigation has ended with the vindication of all public officials. Lawson's charges were not substantiated. Advance information was furnished by newspapermen who jumped at conclusions. And then on February 28th, 1917, we see report blames 2 reporters for leak. A unanimous report saying no one save 2 Washington newspapermen, J. Fred Essery and W. W. Price, were responsible for whatever leak there was on President Wilson's peace note, was presented to the House tonight by Chairman Henry of the Rules Committee. All persons connected with the government, including Secretary McAdoo and Secretary Tumulty, members of both houses, and R. W. Bowling, a brother-in-law of the President, are specifically cleared of suspicion. And that would be the end of that. And to turn public attention away from that topic and on to something else, we see the next day, March 1st, 1917, is when the Wilson administration would release the news of the Zimmerman telegram to the public. Talk about good timing. We saw earlier that the Wilson administration knew about it a week earlier on February 24th, but they originally decided to keep it secret from the public, probably so Germany wouldn't know that some of their codes were broken and deciphered. But releasing it to the public only just a week later serves 2 very good purposes. 1, it deflects and takes the conversation away from the leak scandal. And 2, it would help foster even more resentment towards Germany in the public eye, in an effort to sway public opinion into supporting U.S. entry into the war, which, as we'll see, the U.S. was already preparing for. And Bernard Baruch was one of the leading figures in those preparations, which would ultimately lead to an end result of enormous global power and wealth, for a very small few, of course. Going back 6 months to August of 1916, we see the creation of the Council of National Defense in the just passed Appropriations Bill. And then in October of 1916, we see President Wilson name an advisory commission to the Council of National Defense, and on that commission, of course, is Bernard Baruch. Then by December of 1916, the Council would meet for the first time, its members consisting of Newton D. Baker, the Secretary of War, Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, Franklin K. Lane, the Secretary of the Interior, David F. Houston, the Secretary of Agriculture, William C. Redfield, Secretary of Commerce, and William B. Wilson, the Secretary of Labor. And joining them as the Advisory Commission for the Council of National Defense was Daniel Willard, President of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Samuel Gompers, President of the American Federation of Labor, Dr. Franklin H. Martin, Director General of the American College of Surgeons, Howard E. Coffin, founder of the Hudson Motor Car Company, which later became AMC, or the American Motors Corporation, Wall Street speculator and star of our chapter here, Bernard M. Baruch, Dr. Hollis Godfrey, President of the Drexel Institute of Art, Science and Industry, and Julius Rosenwald, co-owner of Sears Roebuck and Company. And that's the Council of National Defense, meeting for the first time for a series of week-long meetings beginning on December 4th, 1916. And by mid-December, we'd see in the newspapers what their meetings were about. There's their group photo highlighted at the bottom of the page, minus Secretary Lane. And zooming in, it reads, "Seeking to coordinate nations' military, industrial, and economic resources." And there's Bernard Baruch. And below we can see the purpose of the National Council of Defense, which held its first session in Washington last week, is to coordinate the military, industrial, and economic resources of the nation. In other words, the creation of the military-industrial complex, the very same entity that over 40 years later, President Dwight Eisenhower, Ike, would warn us about in his farewell address to the nation on TV.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And it's too bad we didn't listen to Ike's warning, as today it's morphed into what's called the deep state, that many people, who don't actually do any research on the matter, think that it's only a conspiracy theory. But it is real, and this is where it all started. And we'll see as we go, Bernard Baruch was the brains behind it all. In early February of 1917, so about 2 months before the US would enter the war, and a few weeks before the public would know about the Zimmerman telegram, the Council would meet again. Defense Council meets to marshal resources of nation in preparation for war. 3 days later, on February 13th, 1917, we see the United States is rapidly preparing for war, if it comes. And below we can see this series of meetings is the second time the Council of National Defense had gotten together. And we also see that E.R. Stettinius, that's a typo in the paper, of Morgan & Company, who has handled the details of all purchases in this country for the Entente Allies, will tell the Council tomorrow of the best way for mobilizing supplies. Because remember, as we saw earlier, the government would soon be replacing J.P. Morgan as the purchasing agent, which would be fine with Morgan, as he, like the other Wall Street kings, would go on to make massive fortunes with the US now entering the war. And while we're on the subject of Edward Stettinius, we can also see that his son would go on to be Secretary of State during World War II. And that's something you'll notice quite a bit of as we go along in this series. There's many fathers and sons, or brother combos, or family lines that are generational that always seem to be in positions of power. It's something that continues to this day. Anyways, back to the second round of meetings of the Council of National Defense in February of 1917, we see Bernard Baruch appointed. Bernard Baruch will be in charge of rounding up raw materials, minerals, and metals, which would become known as the Raw Materials Division. On March 26, 1917, so a couple of weeks before the United States would enter the war, we see Bernard Baruch of National Defense Council interceding with manufacturers of structural steel. An agreement with American manufacturers by which all structural steel needed for the Navy's building program could be obtained quickly and at a fair price is being sought by Bernard Baruch of the National Defense Council. Mr. Baruch recently secured an agreement with copper producers by which the government will receive millions of pounds of copper at a fixed price. And we'll see coming up that these actions by Bernard Baruch and his group and the companies involved were against the law. And ironically, the law they were violating was the Sherman Antitrust Act, the very same law that the Wall Street kings were being hammered with in the years right up before the war started. By the end of May 1917, with the US now in the war and J.P. Morgan no longer the purchasing agent, we see Bernard Baruch will be expanding his portfolio to include that role as well. But then we see on May 31st, 1917, Barney Baruch eliminated as war purchasing agent. This information has been given by a close advisor of the President, familiar with the war plans and the discussion relative to the strengthening of the bureaus for the war emergency. Mr. Baruch, this informant said, had perhaps innocently caused himself to be mentioned for such a post as a sort of tryout of the President in public opinion. The response from the public, business, and Wall Street was so unanimous against placing Mr. Baruch in any position of unquestioned importance and authority that if the President ever had in mind the naming of the New York broker as the head of the proposed commission, it was quickly abandoned. So it looks like this unnamed close advisor to the President couldn't have been more wrong. And despite the unanimous response from the public, business, and Wall Street against it, we'll see a few weeks later, in June 1917, economic program in hands of three. Policy of government is to concentrate war authority. And we see future President Herbert Hoover, who's going to be in charge of all food across the country, and Bernard M. Baruch, who's going to be in complete control of all purchases for both the Allies and the US, and he would become head of the munitions board as well. And between William Denman or Major General George Goethals, they would have authority over the Navy. So by June 1917, Bernard Baruch was already a member of the Council of National Defense as part of the Advisory Commission, and he was chairman of the Raw Materials Division, and he was the purchasing agent for the US and the Allies, and in control of the Munitions Board. So that's already quite the portfolio, giving him quite a bit of power already. And as we'll see, things were just getting started for Bernard Baruch. And within a couple of months, at the beginning of August 1917, he would continue in all of his roles as a member of the newly formed War Industries Board. The War Industries Board was created so that the kind of deals that Baruch and the others were already doing would now be in compliance with the letter of the law, as we'll see. And 10 months later, in March of 1918, President Wilson placed Bernard Baruch as chairman of the War Industries Board and gave him absolute and full control over everything about it. Now we'll have a glimpse into the congressional investigations called the War Expenditures Hearings that took place right after the war in the years 1919 to 1921. And we'll also look a little bit into the munitions industry hearings that started up 13 years later in 1934. The earlier war expenditures hearings were mostly chaired by Congressman William J. Graham, a Republican from Illinois, while the later munitions industry hearings were chaired entirely by Senator Gerald P. Nye, a Republican from North Dakota, and this was more popularly known as the Nye Committee, which still sees some attention in today's outlets, though not very much. And when it comes to the earlier war expenditures hearings, I've yet to find a mention of them at all among today's various media and online outlets. And I've not yet been able to track down all the different volumes of either sets of investigations. The collections I do have come from various universities around the country, but I don't believe there's one complete surviving set still in existence of either set of investigations. And to give you an idea of how long these are, looking just at Serial 6, Parts 1 to 18 from 1919, the last page of just that one series ends at page 5260. And looking at the munitions industry hearings at the index released by Gerald Nye in 1943, the last page of that clocks in at a whopping 13,752. So there's literally tens of thousands of pages between the two investigations, and some of the information contained within them is quite astonishing. And though we'll mainly be looking at the war expenditures hearings, we'll also have the odd peek at the munitions industry hearings as well. And I'll of course let you know which one we're looking at as we go, but you can also tell by the header on the top of the pages which investigation is which. And just to note, if you're wondering, but we'll be digging into the munitions industry hearings in depth in one of the chapters of Part 2 of this series, and it's absolutely a sequel to the earlier war expenditures hearings. So, looking into the war expenditures hearings, we learn about the War Industries Board. And here we see the chairman, William Graham, ask, how long had the council acted in the procurement of supplies for the Army and Navy? To which Grosvenor Clarkson, who was the secretary of the advisory committee, answers, until January 1918, when the Committee on Supplies turned over its work to the Quartermaster Department. There was about 10 months of great activity with this qualification, that on August 1st, 1917, the Council created a War Industries Board, which on May 28th, 1918, was, by presidential order, made a separate entity. Here we see Representative Albert W. Jafaris ask Bernard Baruch, when was the War Industries Board formed? And Bernard Baruch answers, there was a War Industries Board which followed the Munitions Board under the Council of National Defense, of which I was a member, but still as a raw materials member. The United States War Industries Board, of which I was made chairman on March 4th, and the President changed the War Industries Board into an executive function, I think it was in May, and that became the real United States War Industries Board as we face it today. Here's President Wilson's letter to Bernard Baruch dated March 4th, 1918, appointing Baruch as the chairman of the War Industries Board, which states, My dear Mr. Baruch, I am writing to ask if you will accept appointment as chairman of the War Industries Board. And it's not like Wilson didn't know the answer already. I mean, he wasn't sitting around writing this and thinking, oh, I hope Barney accepts. As I mentioned earlier, the whole idea of a War Industries Board originated from Bernard Baruch to begin with, and we'll see that coming up. But the point is that Wilson already knew the answer, and I'm quite sure they had already discussed this beforehand, and this letter is only a mere formality of permissions for Bernard Baruch to take over. And then on May 29th, 1918, President Wilson would make it an executive order, stating, I hereby establish the War Industries Board as a separate administrative agency to act for me under my direction. This is the board which was originally formed by and subsidiary to the Council of National Defense under the provisions of, quote, an act making appropriations for the support of the Army for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 1917, and for other purposes, end quote, approved August 29th, 1916. The functions, duties, and powers of the War Industries Board, as outlined in my letter of March 4th, 1918, to Bernard Baruch, Esquire, its chairman, shall be, and hereby are continued in full force and effect. And from the Ammunition Industry Hearings, or the NIE Committee, they quote from a volume of the War Expenditures Hearings that I don't have, that they call the Graham Report, which states, on the 11th day of October 1916, the President appointed an advisory commission to the Council of National Defense, which last-named body had been authorized by an act of Congress passed before that time. This advisory commission first met on the 7th day of December 1916. Mr. Bernard Baruch, banker, was the chairman of the commission, organizing to sell to the government. These gentlemen, originally appointed as an advisory board on February 12th, adopted a resolution to the effect that a series of conferences be held with the leading men in each industry, so that the industries could organize themselves and deal through one man or a small committee. It will be seen from the facts hereinafter stated that the plan originally was, and which plan has been fully consummated in the subsequent proceedings, that the copper industry, as well as other producing industries, should be so centralized that it could be dominated and controlled by one man, or a very small number of men, and that this control, once established over the industries, continued throughout the war, was the paramount influence toward price fixing and price control, and is one of the causes of high-priced commodities at this time, 1921. The plan of the government was to centralize all industries irrespective of the results that might ultimately follow. And more from William Graham from the War Expenditures Hearings on July 7, 1919, where he states, the matter that is before us today is the minutes of the Council of National Defense and of the Advisory Commission of the Council. I've been asked by the committee to prepare such portions of the minutes of the Council of National Defense and Advisory Commission as seem to be pertinent to the subject matter we are inquiring about. The matter being investigated by this committee at present is the general method that was pursued in the purchase of supplies for the War Department during the war. An examination of these minutes discloses the fact that a commission of 7 men chosen by the President seemed to have devised the entire system of purchasing war supplies, planned to press censorship, designed a system of food control, and selected Herbert Hoover as its director, determined on a daylight saving scheme, and in a word, designed practically every war measure which the Congress subsequently enacted, and did all this behind closed doors, weeks and even months before the Congress of the United States declared war against Germany. The Act establishing the Council of National Defense, approved August 29, 1916, made 6 members of the Cabinet members of the Council, and in addition provided for an advisory commission of 7 to be appointed by the President. The members of this advisory commission were Hollis Godfrey, Howard E. Coffin, Bernard Baruch, Samuel Gompers, Franklin H. Martin, Julius Rosenwald, and Daniel Willard. It appears from the minutes of the advisory commission and the Council, which were kept separately, that practically all of the measures which were afterward considered as war measures were initiated by this advisory commission, adopted by the Council, and afterwards acted upon by Congress. In many cases, a considerable period before the actual declaration of war with Germany, this advisory commission was discussing matters which were thought to be new legislation, conceived by reason of the necessities of war. For instance, on March 3rd, over a month before the war declaration, the Advisory Commission endorsed to the Council of National Defense a daylight saving scheme and recommended a federal censorship of the press. This censorship was first suggested, as the minutes show, by a correspondent by the name of Philip Patchen. The question of federal censorship of the press was further discussed on March 24th, 2 weeks before the declaration of war. On February 15th, about 2 months before the declaration of war, Commissioners Coffin and Gompers made a report as to the exclusion of labor from military service, and the draft was discussed. The draft was also discussed on other occasions before anyone in this country, except this advisory commission, and those who were closely affiliated with the administration, knew that a declaration of war was to be later made. At a meeting on February 15th, this same commission of 7 men, none of whom had any official authority except as advisors, recommended that Herbert Hoover be employed by the government in connection with food control. It was generally understood, as it appears from the minutes, that Mr. Hoover was to be in control of this matter, although war was 2 months in the future. The Advisory Commission first met on December 6, 1916. Almost the first thing the Commission did was to take up the matter of arranging an easy method of communication between the manufacturers and the government. On February 12th, for example, Secretary Lane offered a resolution to the Advisory Commission suggesting to them to call a series of conferences of leading men in various industries, so the industries might organize and be able to do business with the Council through one man. In several meetings long before the war was declared, this Advisory Commission of 7 men met with representatives of the manufacturing industries and formed an organization for them selling supplies to the government, which organization was well perfected before the war was declared. This method consisted of having the representatives of the various businesses producing goods which the government would have to buy, form themselves into committees so that they might be able to sell to the government the goods direct which their industries produced. In almost every meeting that this Advisory Commission had before the declaration of war, they discussed and recommended to the Council, which consisted of 6 cabinet members, these plans for fixing prices and selling to the government. When war was declared on April 6, this machinery began to move, headed by the Advisory Commission of 7 men, who were, in effect, as shown by these minutes, the active government of the United States, so far as the purchase of supplies was concerned. So far as I can observe, there was not an act of the so-called war legislation afterward enacted that had not before the actual declaration of war been discussed and settled upon by this Advisory Commission. At times, the activities of this Advisory Commission were such as to greatly embarrass the Cabinet, and it was necessary for the Council to protest against them. The minutes also show that this Advisory Commission were advised that they were violating the law and permitting committees of the Council of National Defense to direct purchases from their own companies, as will be apparent from a letter read by Mr. Baruch on June 1st to the Commissioners, which he received from Mr. E.H. Gary, Chairman of the Committee on Steel and Steel Production of the Advisory Commission. This letter is quite interesting and is set out in full in the minutes, and is as follows. And this is Chairman William Graham quoting Bernard Baruch as he addressed the Commissioners and read to them the letter he received from Albert H. Gary. I send you herewith a copy of letter just received from one of the manufacturers in reply to your request for detailed information concerning the supply of ferromanganese on hand. I do not add the names. The letter speaks for itself. If there is any question in regard to these matters, we should know it now. The letter referred to by Mr. Gary reads as follows, and I won't read the whole letter, but in reference to some of the committees under the Council of National Defense and the Advisory Commission, Albert Gary says, they were operating in flagrant disregard of the Sherman Law, the Clayton Law, and all the other statutes that were supposed to regulate business, particularly big business. The least they could do would be to have Congress pass resolutions suspending operation of these laws. This letter was referred to the Attorney General on the 2nd of June, and on the 6th of June the Attorney General answered it, saying that matters referred to in Mr. Gary's letter as violations of the law were matters of, quote, national, end quote, policy rather than a legal question. Afterwards, when there was evidently a discussion in Congress as to the illegality of members of committees on the Council buying from themselves, the Council discussed this general policy, and it was suggested that, quote, this embarrassment might be removed by the plan of the committee reorganization now under consideration, end quote. Afterwards, the minutes show that on account of this so-called embarrassment, the War Industries Board was created, and committees appointed by the National Chamber of Commerce, so that the letter of the law might be complied with, but by which scheme no part of the method of buying was changed in the slightest degree so far as I can observe. And looking into some more minutes, this time from the Council of National Defense, going back into the munitions industry hearings of the 1930s, we see the infamous Alger Hiss, who was first an investigator, then later an assistant counsel for the hearings, and in 1948 was busted for spying for the Soviet Union. Anyways, Hiss would state, turning to the topic that we were discussing just before recess, relating to the understanding of the problems arising during the World War, before the War Industries Board, I show you, Colonel Harris, some excerpts from the minutes of meeting of the Council of National Defense held July 28, 1917, which I offer for appropriate number. That reads, all members of the Council and the Director were present. There ensued a discussion of the reorganization plan, which was finally approved and released for the press in the following form. Quote, the Council of National Defense today decided with the approval of the President to create a small body to be known as the War Industries Board, end quote. And that's the first version of the War Industries Board. And as we saw, doing this allowed the activities that Bernard Baruch and the rest of the Council and Advisory Commission had been doing illegally since December of 1916 to now be legal, in continuing these same activities, meaning the organization of industry, deciding who gets what contracts, the fixing of prices, and so on. Just below, Eldrehis continues reading from the minutes of the Council of National Defense, saying, then, jumping to the second page, the second full complete paragraph reads, of this board, Mr. Baruch will give his attention particularly to raw materials, Mr. Brookings to finished products, and Mr. Lovett to matters of priority. These three members, in association with Mr. Hoover, so far as foodstuffs are involved, will constitute a commission to arrange purchases in accordance with the general policies formulated and approved. Which means Bernard Baruch basically continued in the same role as before, only now it was being done legally. And although he wasn't the chairman until 10 months later in March of 1918, he was most definitely the most active member as well as the public face of the council, and he was basically running things more and more as things went along. And remember, as I've mentioned a couple times, the whole thing was his idea to begin with, which is why by March 4th, 1918, President Wilson put him in control of it all, with the final word on everything, as we'll see. Going back to the war expenditures hearings and talking about Sherman Act violations, we see Representative Finis Garrett asking Bernard Baruch, did any troubles arise with the committees growing out of the legal situation that you are a member of? To which Bernard Baruch responds, the committees of the trade, especially some of those which I had asked to serve, were very much disturbed about their standing in reference to the Sherman antitrust law. Is that what you refer to? And Garrett says yes. And Baruch continues, and also in regard to the Lever Act, on the point that, quote, no man could serve two masters, end quote. That was practically the gist of it as to the committee I had appointed and was working with. There was no basis for it, certainly so far as the latter was concerned, because these men were not serving two masters. They did not make trades with themselves, but with the instrumentality provided, carried out the government's wishes, or orders, or suggestions with reference to the particular industry which they represented. Judge Gary, if I remember, was the man who brought this to our attention through a letter that another man had written him personally. I am not a lawyer, and therefore I can give an expert opinion. I think he meant to say I can't give an expert opinion. But then he goes on to say, there may have been some breaking of the law, but I assume full responsibility, whatever that means. And of course, that would ultimately mean that he gets hailed as a hero, even up for a war medal, as we'll see later on. Here we see Representative Albert Jafaris asking Bernard Baruch, what method did you pursue in mobilizing the various industries? And Bernard Baruch answers, I thought I had outlined it before. I shall do it again. My thought was to get within as compact an executive body as possible the full knowledge of the production and distribution of that particular material. With that end in view, I selected certain men within that industry and put them on a committee through which I could act. I did not call them at all. I selected them first, and I talked the matter over with a man whom I thought would know about it more than anybody else. And remember, we just saw him say they weren't trading with themselves, but rather with the, quote, instrumentality provided, end quote. Except that Baruch was the one who handpicked all the industry people to sit on the various government committees, which in turn was the instrumentality provided. And let's have a look into how that worked. Here's Representative John Mackenzie asking Grosvenor Clarkson, Secretary of the Advisory Committee, now, isn't it a fact that those gentlemen represented a practical control of the entire copper output of this country? And Clarkson replies, without posing as an expert on the matter, I think that was so, and I think it was the intention to have it so that cooperation might be had such as it was felt could not be had in any other way. Then Mackenzie asks, then it naturally follows, does it not, Mr. Clarkson, that any contract which was made for copper in behalf of the government by those gentlemen of necessity must have been given to themselves. In other words, they represented both sides of the deal, isn't that true? And Clarkson replies, that is the assumption of which it may very easily be taken, if a critical attitude in the matter is taken. And then Mackenzie would ask, if we were sure that they succeeded in keeping down the price of a commodity, why of course we could see some virtue in that sort of an organization. But isn't it a fact that copper gradually and surely ascended in price month after month? To which Clarkson replies, yes it did. And Mackenzie asks, and the government finally paid as high as 32 cents or 34 cents a pound for it, did it not? To which Clarkson answers, yes. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that's double what the price was set at when the United States entered the war. Then we see Representative James Freer ask Clarkson, In order to preserve the record right, the question that Mr. Mackenzie, a member of the committee, drew out was this: that all copper, taking this metal as an illustration, was practically in the hands of the gentlemen who are on the subcommittee. Then he asked you, did not those men make arrangements for contracts for copper? And Clarkson responds, that is right. And James Freer states, and your reply, in substance, was that it was true, but they did not sign the contracts. And Clarkson agrees, saying, yes sir, that is absolutely true. And below that we see Freer asking, on yesterday you said, if I remember correctly, that all those contracts were passed up for the approval of the War Department, and you did not know of a single case where there was any effort to revise the recommendation of the subcommittee of the Council of National Defense. And Clarkson says, I can recall no case, and in responding to that question, I so stated. And Freer responds, I am just trying to get the policy and the method. Then it is a fact, is it not, that in all these cases the men who made the recommendations were the men who had control of the business, but that the men who signed the contracts were members of the Army or the Navy, and they signed them in every case, so far as your information goes, upon the recommendation of those gentlemen. And Clarkson replies, that is correct, so far as I know, sir. So Bernard Baruch selected the members of the subcommittees of the Council of National Defense from the experts of the leading industries throughout the United States, in other words the companies his Wall Street buddies owned, and they decided on the prices that the government should have to pay for the various items and materials, prices that rose substantially of course as the war went on. And they also decided on who got what contracts, and how much of which materials and things like that. But they weren't the ones who actually signed off on the paperwork, but rather that was done by members of the military. And that's the instrumentality provided that Bernard Baruch speaks of when he says that the industrial leaders on the subcommittees did not make trades with themselves, which is just simply the opposite of the truth, as in every single case that was to be found, it was the recommendation of the subcommittees, or the industrial leaders appointed by Baruch, that was signed off on by either the Army or the Navy. Now let's go back to the munitions industry hearings and have a look at some of the subcommittees that were setting prices. And this was under the first War Industries Board. And we can see on December 10th, 1917, there was a meeting called to consider steel prices with representatives of the steel industries. And the War Industries Board personnel attending this meeting were all these guys. And they set the price of steel with all these guys from the various steel companies. And there's Charles M. Schwab, chairman of Bethlehem Steel, along with Eugene Grace, longtime president of Bethlehem Steel. And Schwab was previously the president of J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel. And there's 3 people representing U.S. Steel, including Albert H. Gary, who we saw earlier, and was chairman of U.S. Steel at the time. And of course U.S. Steel and Bethlehem Steel were the biggest steel profiteers of World War I, with U.S. Steel averaging a whopping $239 million in profits each year for 4 years of the war, while Bethlehem Steel would come in at second with a profit of nearly $50 million a year for the same duration. And one thing that gets me is that of all these people who set the pricing for steel, the only one whose job would want the lowest price possible would be Brigadier General Palmer E. Pierce, as he was military, and he was also an assistant to the Secretary of War, Newton Baker. I mean, the rest of these guys would want to see the prices as high as possible, some of them for the obvious reason of being part of the steel industry, while others are industrialists in a different spectrum, and others for wanting higher wages for employees, and so on. But all these guys would decide on the price of steel, and send it on up to the War Department, who would then sign off on it. And it was Bernard Baruch who handpicked all the representatives from the steel industry. And we'll have a look at how they set the prices shortly, which explains the huge profits that were made. But while we're still here, I came across this which I found very interesting about Harry, who also went by the name Henry Payne Bingham, who was the War Industries Board Secretary. And this is from the munitions industry hearings in 1934, Part 13, titled Profiteering, Government Contracts, and Expenditures During World War. And the chairman, Senator Gerald Nye, makes this statement about Bingham. Mr. Bingham, who came into evidence as Secretary of the War Industries Board, was the Henry Payne Bingham who appears as one of those enjoying incomes during the war period of more than $1 million a year. Incidentally, his service as Secretary of the Board was on the $1 a year basis. The committee has been unable to ascertain the business connections of Mr. Bingham, but will, during the course of its study, so ascertain. So he was one of those enjoying more than $1 million a year income on a $1 a year salary. And Bernard Baruch was another of the $1 a year club as well. Anyways, 4 days later, on December 14th, there was a special meeting of the copper industry, and there were present the same members of the War Industries Board referred to in the meeting of December 10th that we just looked at. And of the copper industry representatives, the first one we see is Cornelius Francis Kelly of Anaconda Copper, which was a Rockefeller enterprise, being run by William Rockefeller. And of course, Anaconda Copper would have the highest profits in the war of any in the copper industry. Then we see the same group representing the War Industries Board meeting about setting prices for TNT and powders. And then after a few more days of talking about steel, they set the price on December 28th. Again. And I say again because remember, Bernard Baruch had already made deals and fixed prices in early 1917, when it was technically illegal still, until they created the War Industries Board. And they would again fix prices when Baruch took over the War Industries Board in March of 1918. And it's ironic they would call it fixed prices, or have a price-fixing committee, when what actually happened was that the price for everything just kept increasing year after year. And just to point out, because we just saw examples of Bernard Baruch dealing directly with companies owned by the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan, here's an example of Baruch dealing with the DuPonts in that earlier period of 1917 I mentioned, where Baruch was cutting deals and setting prices with the various industries. And of course, the DuPonts profited over $200 million during the war years, selling war materials worth a gross value of over $2 billion. And we can see the DuPont's assets grew massive during the war years, and then continued to grow even larger in the years between World War I and World War II. And we'll see some of why that is when we get into part 2 of this series. And remember, the two purchasing agents who decided who got what contracts during the war years were first J.P. Morgan, and then Bernard Baruch, the DuPont's good buddies on Wall Street. Now let's quickly meet Major General William Crozier, who was the longtime Chief of Ordnance of the War Department, and he states, "I held the office of Chief of Ordnance until July 1918, but I ceased to exercise the duties of Chief of Ordnance on December 20th, 1917, having been assigned upon that date as a member of the War Council and relieved from duties as Chief of Ordnance," which coincidentally was the same day Bernard Baruch and the War Industries Board were meeting and considering TNT prices. Anyways, about the Sherman antitrust laws, Major General Crozier had this exchange with Chairman William Graham, where Graham asked, "To be specific, you knew that the antitrust laws were being violated, did you not? By having prices fixed by the industry or by representatives of the industry? That they would meet and fix prices, and that was a violation of the letter of the law?" And General Crozier responds, "For instance, as to the price of shell steel, which was made by a considerable number of manufacturers, the price of which was fixed by the agreement between the War Industries Board and the steel makers?" And Chairman Graham says, "Yes, was it ever suggested?" And then he's interrupted by General Crozier, who says, "I must say, Mr. Chairman, that I did not in the matter particularly concern myself with the bearing of the antitrust law at the time. The object of the antitrust law, as I knew, was to prevent suppression of competition, and competition had gone by the board altogether. There was no more competition possible." Now let's take a look at some more testimony from Bernard Baruch on February 27th, 1920. And here's where he talks about the $30 billion cost of the war to the American people. And here we see him explain, "We fixed the prices in cooperation with the industries, but when we fixed a price, we fixed it for the total production, not alone for the Army and Navy, but for the Allies and the civilian population." And below that he says, "Later on, when the President centralized the authority in a chairman, which was myself, the price-fixing committee was composed of the following representatives." And then he goes on to list who they were. And he's the one that appointed them all, too. And here he explains, "In that way, we had a control of the industries without the government running them itself. We controlled its production, we controlled its price, we controlled its distribution, and when the war was over, we turned them loose. And they went along, and there is no complaint from the business interests of their inability to function now. The businesses themselves were not injured. You think? He helped pump billions of dollars into their coffers. How injured could they have been?" Anyways, here's Congressman Albert Jaffaris asking Bernard Baruch, Your intention was to call all the leading men of the large companies to serve on these committees? And Bernard Baruch replies, the leading men who knew more about it. There are some men who hold prominent positions always in every industry who do not know perhaps as much about it as some of the other men who are not so well known. My object was to get the best brains and knowledge of the production and distribution of the material in that industry. And here we see this exchange with Congressman Jafaris asking, you mentioned a little while ago that this board had powers over raw materials, etc. all over the world, as I understood it. And Baruch answers, yes sir. Jafaris, in what lines did this board of 10 have the powers that you mentioned? Baruch, we had the power of priority, which was the greatest power in the war. Jafaris, in other words, you determined what anybody could have? Baruch, exactly, there was no question about that. I assumed that responsibility, sir, and the final determination rested within me. Congressman Jafaris asks him, what? And Bernard Baruch explains, that final determination, as the President said, rested within me. The determination of whether the Army or Navy should have it rested with me. The determination of whether the Railroad Administration could have it, or the Allies, or whether General Allenby should have locomotives, or whether they should be used in Russia or used in France. Here Jafaris asks him, about how many committees were there just in a general way? And Baruch answers, I could not tell you, sir. For instance, there was a man in charge of practically every material and every manufacturing interest. And Jafaris asks, and all of those different lines really, ultimately centered in you, so far as power was concerned? And Baruch answers, yes sir, it did. I probably had more power than perhaps any other man did in the war. Doubtless that is true. And by now I'm sure you can understand a little bit better why he would say that. And now let's have a quick look at how they were setting the prices. And Jafaris asks, now then, if I get you right, the Lucan's price of producing steel was much higher than some of its competitors before the war? Baruch answers, that is right, and during the war. Jafaris, and during the war you say? Baruch, yes, and doubtless now. Jafaris, and in order to get what Lucan's and Company would produce, the price that was paid to all of them was largely determined by the price for the Lucan Steel and Iron Company? Baruch, yes sir, to a very considerable extent. Jafaris, and necessarily the companies that produced steel at a much lower cost than the Lucan Steel and Iron Company claimed they could produce it and made large profits, didn't they? Baruch, yes, but not to the extent that you would imagine. Jafaris, for instance, this whole situation that you have described is illustrated in the case of Lucan's Iron and Steel Company. Was that true in the other lines of industry insofar as prices were concerned, Mr. Baruch? Baruch, oh yes sir. Jafaris, during the whole time of the war? Baruch, yes sir. So to understand what this means, the smaller companies in the various different industries have a higher cost for them to be able to produce their product than the bigger companies do, and for a host of various different reasons of course. And using Lucan Steel and the smaller steel producers for example, they might not have their own refining capabilities, or perhaps they don't own their own transportation methods, etc. Whereas companies like US Steel did have everything like that in place, and could produce steel at a much lower cost to them versus their smaller competitors. So Bernard Baruch and his committee set the price so the smaller companies would be able to still make a profit, and because the price was quote fixed, end quote, the bigger companies who could produce steel at a much lower cost would see much higher profits. And don't forget, the bigger companies like US Steel for example were the ones producing the majority of the steel, as much as 85% of it. Now I'm not suggesting that any companies shouldn't make a profit of course, but it's war, and everybody's expected to make some sacrifices, whether it's the soldiers on the battlefields, the farmers in the cornfields, or the everyday ordinary average citizens donating their cutlery and pots and pans for the war effort, and so on. But paying the big manufacturers huge profits, simply because the smaller manufacturers need to be paid at a higher rate in order for them to be able to squeak out a tiny profit, is ridiculous. Especially when the smaller companies like Lucan's only produced up to like 5 or 10% of the steel used in the war. This is a good part of the reason why it cost the American taxpayers $30 billion during World War I. Instead of coming to a reasonable agreement about profits and using a percentage-based formula, they just simply doled out billions to the big suppliers under the guise that it was the only way to get all the manufacturers of whatever product on board. So while everyone else in the country was making sacrifices in their daily lives in order to help the war effort, Wall Street kings and industrialists like these guys were busy padding their profit margins and bank accounts. And that was all thanks to their Wall Street buddy, Bernard Baruch. And remember I said, it was his plan the whole time. And that comes from Bernard Baruch himself. Here we can see the munitions industry hearings chairman, William Graham, asking Baruch, "I assume that you were personally acquainted with the president prior to the outbreak of the war?" To which Bernard Baruch answers, "Yes, sir." Then Graham asks, "Up to the time that you were appointed as a member of the advisory commission, had you ever had any personal conferences with the president about these matters?" And Baruch answers again, "Yes, sir." And he goes on to say about some of his thoughts on the country's preparedness for war and some of his actions in 1915. And then he says, "Yes, 1915. And I had been thinking about it very seriously, and I thought we'd be drawn into the war. I went off on a long trip, and it was while on this trip that I felt there ought to be some mobilization of the industries. And I was thinking about the scheme that was practically put into effect and was working when I was chairman of the board. When I came back from that trip, I asked for an interview with the president, and it was the first time I had seen the president since his election, so far as I can remember now." And Graham asks him, "You mean his first election?" And Baruch answers, "His first election, yes. I explained to him as earnestly as I could that I was very deeply concerned about the necessity of the mobilization of the industries of the country." And Graham asks him, "Do you have any idea approximately of when that conversation with the president was, Mr. Baruch? Was it in 1915 or 1916? The National Defense Act was passed in the fall of 1916, in August." And Baruch answers, "It was long before that. I think it was in the summer of 1915, after I had gone to the San Francisco Fair. I think that was in 1915. And Graham asks, "Did the president express any opinion about the advisability of adopting the scheme you proposed?" And Baruch answers, "I think I did most of the talking. I do not remember what the president said on that subject, but I think it can best be seen as expressed by the bill." And he's talking about the National Defense Act that was passed in August 1916. So in the summer of 1915, Bernard Baruch came up with the quote, scheme, end quote, and told the president his idea. And no doubt he had his eye on what J.P. Morgan was doing during that time frame. And then the National Defense Act was passed in August of 1916, which allowed the creation of the Council of National Defense, which held its first series of meetings in early December of 1916. And this is quite literally the birth of what would become known as the military-industrial complex. And then in August of 1917, the first War Industries Board was created, which took things over. And in March of 1918, the War Industries Board was reorganized with Baruch as the chairman. But unlike the previous chairman, Daniel Willard, Baruch was given absolute complete authority and power over all of its branches. And then he would finalize the vision he started thinking about in 1915. And the one constant through it all? Well, Bernard Baruch, of course. It's why I said I agreed with that Esquire article that we saw earlier in this chapter that said he was as constant as the Northern Star. And he would go on to live and mingle in the circles of the rich and powerful, and had decades-long friendships with people like Winston Churchill and President Hoover, and was very good friends with President Eisenhower. And he was appointed to diplomatic missions and sat on various committees and so on, as well as being an advisor to many presidents including Ike, FDR, JFK, and LBJ. Which makes sense, as Bernard Baruch would be the natural go-to guy if you were the president and wanted to understand the machinery known as the military-industrial complex. Who would know better than the guy who invented it to begin with? Now let's have a quick look at the American War Government, published by Oxford University in October of 1920 on behalf of the American Historical Association. And we see this passage here about before World War I. The United States has never, by prearrangement, made itself ready for immediate defense or for precipitate attack. In every military crisis, war has begun first and armies have been created afterwards. By September 1918, the organization of the American War Government was complete. By the side of the normal civil agencies with restricted powers, it comprised a series of boards and administrations exercising dictatorial authority over economic and social matters. It marked, in the term of 18 months, a genuine attempt at the complete transition from the doctrine of individualism and free competition to one of centralized national cooperation, which was properly symbolized in the pregnant phrase, quote, "work or fight," end quote. Now let's go over to Wall Street and have a look at The Chronicle of Wall Street by John Moody, published in 1921. And John Moody was the founder of today's Moody Investment Services, which is one of the top credit rating companies dealing with multinational corporations and governments. And back in 1921, John Moody would write, "Thus the war had given Wall Street an entirely new role. Hitherto, or meaning before, it had been exclusively the headquarters of finance. Now it became the greatest industrial mart the world had ever known. In addition to selling stocks and bonds, financing railroads, and performing the other tasks of a great banking center, Wall Street began to deal in shells, cannons, submarines, blankets, clothing, shoes, canned meats, wheat, and the thousands of other articles needed for the prosecution of a great war. And of course Wall Street would begin to deal in war materials all over the world. There was now a huge industry complete with infrastructure already in place, making billions of dollars. So do you really think they would just pack it all up because the war was over? Remember that article from 1936 we looked at earlier a couple times? That said, American entry into the World War laid emphasis on the development of the munitions exports from practically nothing before the war to huge trade in 1917. And that huge trade continued on after the war, which is the reason the munitions industry hearings would take place in the 1930s. And we'll dive into those investigations in part 2 of this series. But here's an interesting example in part 15, released in 1935, which has the title, Industrial Organization in War, Examples in World War, and Plans for Next War. And in it we see Lieutenant Colonel Charles Harris again saying, "I must say that our industrial planning is in the hope of commencing the next war, somewhat as we were performing at the end of the last war, due to the experience, but there will be many confusions." And then Irene DuPont cuts in saying, "Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask if it is proper that Colonel Harris give his views on what the effect would be of nationalization of industry, which I understood had been advocated as a substitute for the past method. I think that might be rather important testimony here." And clearly, Irene DuPont doesn't want Lieutenant Colonel Harris talking about industrial planning. And commencing the next war? This is 1935. Hitler hasn't even taken over the Rhineland yet. And we'll get into all that in one of the chapters of part 2 of this series. But now you know how the military-industrial complex was born. And we saw that the brains behind its creation was Wall Street speculator Bernard Baruch. And though Baruch left the War Industries Board at the end of 1918, it's ironic that the enormous military-industrial machine that he had built up during the war, that saw what I call the Wall Street Kings lead the way in making huge profits, and we saw how that was set up. But I find it ironic that Baruch also set up this massive industrial machine, in part for a while, by breaking the very laws that saw the companies of the Wall Street Kings being broken up with in the years before the war. And then these same Wall Street Kings would go on to sell arms and munitions and other war materials the world over, which we'll look at in part 2 of this series. Now you know the legacy that Bernard Baruch left behind, that you don't really hear about in modern outlets. And remember I said he would receive a war medal for his service? Looking back at the war expenditures hearings in 1920, they were talking about who should receive the Distinguished Service Medal. And in the memorandums entered into the record, we see this one dated from December 16th, 1919. Sent from Benedict Crowell, the Assistant Secretary of War, to Newton Baker, the Secretary of War. And Crowell writes, "Agreeable to your request of yesterday, I'm listing herewith those persons whom I believe should receive the Distinguished Service Medal." And the list of names goes on to the next page, but in amongst those names is Bernard Baruch. And then on December 27, 1919, Colonel Fulton Q.C. Gardner, Secretary of the General Staff, writes, "The Chief of Staff directs that the papers herewith be referred to the Decorations Board for action, as indicated in the memorandum of the Secretary of War of this date, herewith." And here's the memorandum from the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, on the same date, with actionable instructions for the Decorations Board. And Newton Baker writes, "I have re-examined the law under which distinguished service medals are authorized to be awarded, and I am clear that the intention of the Congress was to limit these awards to persons serving with the Army, and that under such an interpretation, the services rendered by civilians through the Advisory Commission of the Council of National Defense, the War Industries Board, and other like agencies cannot be so recognized." So the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, has ruled that the law and the intention of Congress disqualifies civilians on the Council of National Defense and the War Industries Board from being awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, which means that Bernard Baruch is not eligible. But not to worry, because a year later, in December of 1920, ironically enough, Secretary Baker, at the direction of the President, has awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Bernard M. Baruch. And then a month later, in January of 1921, we see Bernard M. Baruch was decorated Friday with the Distinguished Service Medal by Secretary Baker. And I wonder how Baker felt about being overruled by the President, and not only that, but having to present the award himself. Remember, we just saw a year earlier that Baker had ruled that civilians who served on the Council of National Defense and the War Industries Board could not be recognized for the award. And here he is a year later having to present it to civilian Bernard Baruch, at the direction of President Wilson, Baruch's good friend. I'll bet the Kings of Wall Street thought he deserved the award. And we'll see a little bit more of Bernard Baruch in the next chapter, and some of the connections and decisions he made during the war that perhaps have ended up as having the most consequential direct impact on the world we live in today.